I have a couple signs about the table saw taped to the front of my toolbox over here, and I suggest that you read them regularly. Reread them, even if you've read them before, reread them again. These two signs involve safety rules and guidelines for the table saw and how to avoid a kickback. So first up, safety on the table saw. Always wear eye protection. Never use the table saw without safety glasses or face shield. Never turn on the machine before clearing the table of objects and tools. As I've said in a previous video, this is specifically for everything to the left of the rip fence. It's common to have maybe your tape measure or square on the right of the rip fence because you've been measuring something, and that's fine. But the table to the left of the rip fence where the blade is should always be completely clear of everything except your workpiece. Also, make sure that the piece of wood you are about to cut is not in contact with the blade before you start the saw up. This can be very dangerous. The blade height should be anywhere from about a ½ inch to an inch above the top surface of the wood that you're cutting. So the blade should stick out about a ½ inch to an inch above the top of the piece of wood that you're cutting. It shouldn't be more than that. If you're cutting a thin piece of plywood, you don't need 3 or 4 inches of saw blade sticking up. That's just as dangerous. When you're ripping a board using the rip fence, make sure that you push that board all the way past the rear of the blade before releasing it. Remember, the safety guard on our blade has a little tooth mechanism that catches the wood and keeps it from backing out, which is called a kickback. So you want to make sure that you are all the way past the blade and that small tooth has locked into your piece of wood. The O on the rip fence is a good measure for that. The O in stop, on saw stop, on the logo, if you push past that O, you are past the blade and you're safe. Always use a push stick when you're cutting or ripping narrow boards. You don't want to put your finger between the rip fence and the blade. I say if the board is narrower than 5 or 6 inches, use a push stick. And if you're concerned about it, just use a push stick all the time. I tend to orient my push stick to the left of the workpiece so that it's closer to the blade than the rip fence, and I sort of push it at a diagonal towards the back right corner of the board, and this makes sure that the board that I'm cutting stays against the rip fence and I get a nice clean straight cut. And always make cuts with the good side of the wood facing up. Sometimes wood can chip. We have a nice new blade, so this probably won't happen, but if you're really concerned about the quality of the cut, then have the good side up and the bad side down, the back of the board or whatever, facing down in case it does chip or splinter. Now, let's talk about ways to avoid kickbacks. This is one of the most important things in using the table saw, and I think you should review this very frequently. And remember, a kickback is when the wood that is trapped between the blade and the rip fence doesn't engage the locking system for whatever reason, and it comes flying back out of the machine at you. This is extremely dangerous. If you're working on a saw that doesn't have an electronic brake, this is an easy way to lose a finger. Even with our saw, if you get hit with a kickback, you are going to get very hurt. It can break bones. I knew someone who had a shattered hip from a kickback. It can also hurt someone in the room standing far away. Kickbacks can fly all the way across the room and destroy things. So please do not let this happen. First off, never saw boards or pieces of wood that are badly twisted or warped. Also, never saw anything that's round on the table saw. Everything should be flat and relatively square. Also, never use wood that has nails in it. You should only be using new, fresh lumber on the table saw. No used wood, no wood with paint. If it's been painted, you're not sure if there's a nail or a screw under there. And the moment that the blade on our table saw hits a piece of metal, the brake will engage and it will ruin the brake and the blade. Never freehand cut on the table saw. You should always be using either the rip fence or the CROSSCUT guide, and never both at the same time. Do not use the rip fence as a guide for cutting. It's tempting to set the rip fence at the measurement you need for a bunch of little pieces and then use the CROSSCUT guide to just zip the board along and make all of the pieces that you need. But every time that you finish a cut, the piece, the cutoff that you're trying to make is sitting between the blade and the rip fence, and it can come shooting back out of the machine and hurt you or someone else. Make sure that the rip fence is parallel with the blade, that it's sitting straight on the table. This shouldn't be a problem with our saw. It's well adjusted. I check it for square frequently, and it's new. But if you ever notice that the rip fence looks a little crooked, come and talk to me. Don't try to fix it yourself. Never saw wet wood. It's a good way to get a kickback. And also, if wet wood comes in contact with our saw blade, it will engage the brake. So these are common ways to avoid kickbacks with a table saw. And again, please review these posters frequently. I have them posted on the front of the toolbox for a reason. These are very common ways to get hurt or destroy a tool. We don't want to see that happen.